Good morning. Welcome to the House Committee on Government Operations and Military Affairs. It is Wednesday, January 24th, and we are here to pick up our work on our bills regarding both municipal ethics and miscellaneous state ethics recommendations from the State Ethics Commission. And I am pleased to kind of begin taking a little testimony and also diving in and working through some questions with Legislative Council that the committee has this morning. So before we head into testimony, I was wondering, Executive Director Silbert, if you wanted to, if there was additional things that you wanted to get on the table before we start taking some testimony from other folks that haven't been in the conversation yet, or if you wanted us to start with hearing from some people and then kind of work back through the bill.
Yeah, I think the only thing new that we've submitted would be state charter about financial disclosures and what other states within financial disclosure forms. I haven't provided a chance to review that, but that will hopefully answer some questions for some people from last week.
Is that on our webpage?
Yeah, I think that Andrea has posted it. I haven't looked for it yet, though. We talked about it yesterday. Yeah, so that's, yeah.
On today's date?
Yes.
Thank you.
Great. So great. Then I think what we'll do is invite Mr. Brady, if you want to go ahead and go first, and we'll talk about the municipal ethics bill and get the LCT's perspective.
So much. Good morning.
For
the record, Ted Brady. I'm the Executive Director of the Vermont League of Cities and Towns. Nice to see you again. I appreciate asking for our opinion on the municipal ethics bills. And of course, I do have one. And I will try to really be brief so we can have a conversation. And if the no conversation materializes, then I'll start reading verbatim. That's that. That was not a threat.
I appreciate that approach.
So first, a big headline. Of course, we support the fundamental goal here, establishing ethics standards, educating people about those ethics standards, and then holding those people accountable for those ethics standards at the municipal level. I think from the league's perspective, we think this should be done in three fundamental ways. The expectations and the accountability should be centered at the local level, not at the state level. The state should invest in the capabilities of the LCT and the Secretary of State's office, who are doing this work already to educate people about municipal ethics. And we really think we need to avoid creating a parallel system that hears and investigates complaints about municipal ethics and kind of centers things outside of the courts. When laws get broken, the court system exists to hold people accountable. The current proposal largely, not entirely, but largely does ignore those three fundamental things. And I want to just reiterate, the league has been saying these three fundamental things all along. When we met with the State Ethics Commission this summer, we shared these three kind of central core values. And then in the report, in the listening sessions, we also provided written feedback, which was included. The only piece of written feedback that was included in the State Ethics Commission was a letter from us kind of outlining these three core values. Unfortunately, the legislation that you're looking before you doesn't appear to actually implement any of those three core values. I think the biggest issue we see is it's kind of a cookie cutter approach of, we do appreciate that the effort was made to not just tell municipalities they have to adopt the state code of ethics, right? You're trying to embed it in municipal code, and the code in statute that tells municipalities what they can and can't do. So at the very least, we are trying to put this in the right place, which is where municipalities can and can't do things. The problem is it really looks to us like a cookie cutter version of the state code has just been dropped in to municipal code, which that's where we come up with some problems which I can go into further. And it's also modeled on states like Rhode Island and Massachusetts. Just a quick reminder of Rhode Island. They have 39 municipalities. Almost every single municipality has a professional career, full-time staff person leading that municipality. Half of them are mayors, career mayors, and half of them are town administrators and managers. And they mostly have staff, people to do work. Wouldn't that be a wonderful thing? That's obviously a lot different than the municipalities that about half of you have served in. throughout your time here. I do think, though, there are a couple areas of high overarching agreement. One is we appreciate the idea of using the State Ethics Commission as kind of an ethics ombudsman. There's a lot of times we at the league receive dozens of ethics inquiries a year from members, from select board members and town clerks. Some of them we can help with, some of them we can't. There are times when we're not going to act against the interest of a select board. That's not what we do at the league. And there are catalyst candidates, catalyst people that come in and stir a town up, right? And kind of disrupt the systems that exist. Those people need somebody to go and say, hey, I, as one select board member with no authority, right? Select boards only operate in mass, so one member doesn't have any authority. I need some help here. Is this an ethical issue that I'm facing? And it'd be nice to have an ombudsman that could actually opine and give some feedback to that individual member of a governance body. We specifically see that provision in the bill in page 8, line 3 of the 240461 draft that charges the Ethics Commission with giving opinions. We appreciate that. And we also think if that's going to happen in the other bill, the 0229 bill, the idea of putting the league as a member or having us appoint a member to the State Ethics Commission would make sense if they're going to have oversight over ethics issues. We also support the idea of requiring more training. The league puts on dozens of trainings a year. The Select Board Institute, conflict of interest training, long list of things. A little glitch we see in this system is the legislation you have before you would create what we believe to be the first and only requirement of any training of a municipal official, which would be 2 hours of ethics training. We believe that ethics training is important. There are dozens, if not hundreds of other laws that select board members, town clerks, assessors, auditors, they all need to follow, right? And we don't see that this is any different than all those others. And so if you're going to say 2 hours of ethics, does it open the floodgates to say 2 hours of open meeting, 2 hours of public records? I mean, suddenly you're in the same situation with volunteer firefighters where it takes 200 hours of training to be a volunteer firefighter and we can't find firefighters. So I don't know what the right balance there is, but I don't think this is the right balance. I wanted to also share, we in 2019 published a model conflict of interest policy that incorporates a lot of what this bill has in it. If you recall, back then, you folks mandated that every town have a conflict of interest policy in place. Our conflict of interest policy meets all the criteria of the law. It also extends to some ethics issues, finds things, tries to put things in place to hold people accountable. Several towns have adopted that conflict of interest policy. Others have done it in different ways, have used that as an advisory policy and such. And I included that in my testimony so you can see it on your website. So a couple of quick areas of concern. Largely, I hate to say this, the entire bill concerns me, but just to use, and this is not an exhaustive list, to use a couple of small examples. Section 3 of the 0461 bill tries to codify the state code of ethics in Title 24, right? And here are a couple of just examples of where you run into problems. The entire proposed construct doesn't require an affirmative action by a municipality to adopt the code of ethics. It says like you're going to post it on your wall so you know it exists, right? The existing conflict of interest policy requires a town to adopt a policy. And every select board member, as you can see from our model policy, has to sign, I agree to all these things. And they actually affirmatively act on the policy, they own it, they hold each other accountable to it. This policy just exists in law. Another issue is that section 1992 on page 8, line 12, voids any action taken if a conflict of interest is ever discovered. So imagine 10 years after the town has decided it's going to have a land use policy, we discover that somebody had a conflict of interest. We think the law would allow somebody 10 years later to come back and void that. That is kind of a chaos provision that could create some unintended consequences. And then the final one, just to use as an example, I told you I'd be brief, and this is generally the last thing, is on section 1994, on page 11, line 12, it establishes an employment prohibition that mirrors the state ethics prohibitions on outside employment and post-office employment. think anybody who has served at any town board knows there are a lot of perceived conflicts post-work. In a town of 400 or 500 people, the select board member oftentimes might be, God knows, the next month, the road commissioner, God knows, might be plowing the road, might be a land use lawyer for somebody. It just doesn't work the same way as the state does. Holding a municipal official to the same prohibitions that you hold the governor of the state of Vermont might not be the right balance. This is my actual final thing. We really believe that accountability is the key to any ethics, municipal ethics issue. And right now, very few towns have the ability to recall an official. You know, as a parent, I know the best punishment is served actually warm, not cold. Though it might feel good to do it a year later, it's better to get the person when they do something wrong. And recall elections allow that to happen. You don't have to wait for a 3-year term to end. A recall election allows when somebody, let's say somebody went and got an opinion of the State Ethics Commission that this member did something wrong, you know, did violate the conflict of interest policy. Wouldn't it be nice if immediately the citizens of that town could then call that person to task and say, the select board has censured you. We see this opinion. We want to hold you accountable right now. You just, I think, approved a recall section in one of your charters, right? And I think Essex or Essex Junction had a recall provision in it. So we think it's time to allow every town in Vermont to do that if they so choose by a vote of the town. I have a lot more, but that's it in a nutshell. We're standing ready to work with you folks on trying to address municipal ethics. Like I said, we think there's actually a policy in place that could be built on the conflict of interest provision that's in law that this bill strikes out as its first act. I think we should build there, not throw that away and start with something new. Thanks for the time. Happy to answer any questions.
The questions from the committee, from Mr. Brady. Representative Marzette.
Thank you. Hi. So I have a question. Oh, I have a few. But you said that dropping the state code of ethics into this bill, enforcing it with municipalities is like a cookie cutter kind of thing. What are the parts that you think wouldn't translate well to a municipality that are in the current state code of ethics?
Yeah, I mean, the big three that I mentioned were the fact that the town doesn't have to adopt it. The second is that the issue that nothing is ever settled. Come back and challenge something years later that somebody had a conflict of interest.
Mhm.
The outside employment is another really good example of something that just doesn't fit. You could go through and find a lot of other issues there that if we did a deeper legal analysis, I think we could say this is something that really applies to the state, not to a municipality. Or in an ideal world, it would apply to a municipality, but in a town of 400, it can't. Like you will make it so you cannot fill a position in the local government that doesn't have any professional staff, doesn't have any career staff.
Okay, so it's the parameters surrounding it, not like the code of ethics itself. Like
Oh, no.
Okay.
Like if you look at our model conflict of interest policy,
Yeah,
you'll see almost verbatim language
yes,
in like defining what a conflict is.
right.
When you'd have to recuse yourself, prohibited conduct. So it's not necessarily the content of, defining what ethics are. It's then applying that to a municipality. It's not the same as applying it to the state.
Go ahead, Brian.
I have more. Sorry. But
No,
if I
that's
did-
fine. We had
Right.
time this morning, so
Oh,
the whole
great.
point,
And I have
the
a
whole
question.
point of this morning is like,
Okay.
let's get everything on the table so we actually know what we're working with here.
Yeah, so, I went to the ethics, the forums that they had online, the Ethics Commission, and listened to what people were saying, and it seems like a lot of the struggle comes not from maybe, like, when you said people on a municipal level need to hold themselves accountable. I think part of the problem, and I think what we've heard is that it's not a lack of education and understanding on the part of municipal government. It's more of a culture thing. I'm from a small town, I'm from Charlotte, and it's more of a culture of not having any recourse for either the people in the town or the other people who are on these boards and committees and in the town government. You know what I mean? So what would you see the leap then being to having people? It's nice to think that people would hold themselves accountable always for these things, but it also, we know that that doesn't happen all the time. So if there wasn't legislation or a clear outline for what that would be, then what do you suggest? Or what would be ideal for you
Yeah.
then in that situation?
First, I want to caution, I attended several and watched several of the State Ethics Commission listening sessions also.
Yeah,
And I gotta tell you, I found a lot of input from citizens to be complaints about things that are against the law already. Things like violations to the open meeting law, violations to the Public Record Act. Those, though you could say it's an ethical issue, that is a blatant black and white in statute. This is the law. There's a way to hold people accountable for that. So I just, including some of the comments in the State Ethics Commission's report, they sometimes are blatant violations of the law. You don't need a new law created to hold somebody accountable. You need better ways to make access to the courts, for example. The situations where people, the biggest thing I think we can do when it comes to holding people accountable. So say a body of government does not hold itself accountable. When the local official, the best way to hold a local official who's elected by the people in that town accountable is to enable the people in that town to unseat that person. And that's where I think the recall provision should really be brought in to allow.
thank you.
I just to reiterate, this bill, at least one of the versions, right? I'm not going to find the citation right here, but the one that's about codifying the municipal code of ethics does not have new ways to hold people accountable in it. The accountability question comes up in the other version, which gives the Ethics Commission the ability to investigate and I don't want to say punish, but to then do something with that investigation. On that front, I just say, you know, the State Ethics Commission isn't established to do that for state employees yet and for state officials. Let's teach it to walk before we ask it to run. See how it works holding state officials accountable. Give municipalities more authority to hold themselves accountable. Right now, you folks get to tell them how they can hold each other accountable, you know, because of our wonderful Dillon's rule state. So give us some tools or tell us how you want us to hold ourselves accountable. Our model policy talks about when people need to recuse, how a member of that body would tell that member they should recuse themselves. It talks about how you'd censure somebody. Talks about private censoring somebody. Talks about publicly censoring somebody. You know, there's a process that we've tried to codify in a model policy to address that. I just want to be clear. I'm not saying that municipal ethics shouldn't be addressed. I'm just saying we want to center it at the municipal level.
Representative Waters Evans, did you have more questions?
No, I can stop. Thank you so much.
Other folks, I'm sorry that I didn't quite do the full scan of the table before. So I have a few. Representative Chase, go ahead.
Apologize if you already covered it. The model policy, where else is that in use? Other states, other jurisdictions?
So after 2018, when I think it was 2018, when the conflict of interest provision was put into municipal statute to help towns follow and comply with that, our 4 legal attorneys or 4 municipal assistance attorneys at VLCT built a model policy that we maintain.
From the ground up.
Yep, from the ground up. I don't know if they used anything as a basis, but they then we like last year received 47 inquiries about conflict of interest and ethics. Each time we had one of those 47 inquiries, we talk about the model policy. You'd share it. It's on our website.
Representative Hank.
Thank you. I just want to make a comment about model policies. I'm on a school board and the VSBA comes up with model policies that we all discuss and adopt or not adopt. And in the most cases, we do end up adopting them because they were developed by attorneys who are specific to that field. And then we kind of have continuity with other school districts around the state. So I like the idea of model policies being developed by attorneys at VLCT and having municipalities buy into that by adopting those.
So here's my first question, Ted. How many municipalities have actually adopted and trained their legislative body at least on something that is substantively like your model policy?
Well, it's the law, so everyone, right?
So,
I don't know the answer to your question.
so here's just pulling back. You know, I've been on city council, right? I spent 6 years on city council. A number of us have served on municipal legislative bodies and boards. I don't think we have a culture that is hyper aware of what the current state of the public's expectation is about conflict of interest in the state of Vermont. I think we are behind the times in a lot of ways in many of even our sophisticated staffed city councils and select boards. That there's kind of a feeling of, well, we just kind of trust our legislative body and yeah, we have that policy and we're complying, but there isn't I mean, my impression from my experience and my talking with a lot of towns is that this is not top of mind for most folks. And I think what I'm hearing from you is you'd like us to provide resources for communities if we're concerned about things like nepotism, things like conflict of interest, things like even, you know, I think some of the public comments and things that I've been aware of over, you know, the last few years are things like, you know, staff and other people doing inappropriate things with public funds. And that's, you know, been kind of a chronic fixture of municipal life in Vermont, because I think we put a lot of trust in the local people that get elected and are serving on staff. So I guess what I'm wondering is if we provided the State Ethics Commission with with some more resources to be that resource, wouldn't it make sense for us to have one policy that kind of everybody could say, yes, that makes sense, and maybe there's some flexibility on it, rather than say, here's a model and you municipalities, you know, go through the process, adopt this, do what you will with it. And so I'm just wanting to weigh with you, does it make sense for us to say, take a look at a model and say, municipalities, go out and do your thing? Or would it be more effective for us to provide some resources at a state institution like the State Ethics Commission and say, everybody all understands universally, this is what the ethics policy is for the state of Vermont?
Yeah, I appreciate that many of you around this table have sat on a municipal board. And I hope that the general sense is not that municipal officials are out there in the Wild Wests breaking laws and being unethical. It's rare. There's not a culture of unethical behavior in Vermont municipal government. There's not a culture of misuse of resources. That's I find that fundamentally untrue. I think there need to be standards that our people are educated about. And I think the best example of the way it did this with the conflict of interest is policies are that you, the legislature, required, to your point, a certain level of standards in law. You said, this is what you need to do, town. I think that is completely appropriate. And it should be in the municipal section of the statutes, right? In Title 24. The way you did it with conflict of interest is pretty, we think building on that's the best way to do this. So yes, build more substance in that section. Don't create a 10-page municipal ethics law that defines every nook and cranny based on the state policy, because it just doesn't translate. So that's the big difference.
Other questions from Mr. Brady? I wanted to go to another piece of your testimony was about the voidability of a decision. So I had asked this question, can't remember whether it was on the record or whether it was just with legislative council after, so I apologize for that. I've been working on a lot of stuff. But my understanding in speaking with legislative counsel was that this provision that is in both the statewide bill that we're considering and municipal bill, it would require an action of that body to find that the decision that they made needed to be voided, but it makes it voidable. It doesn't automatically void it. So I had the exact same concern that you brought up about the sort of chaos that it would create to go, oh, we found a conflict of interest, therefore that decision that was made is gone. So I was wondering if that understanding might alleviate some of the concern, or if we specified a little bit better, if that concern might be alleviated. Because I had the exact same reaction when I first read that.
I'd say I don't know. But here's my understanding of municipal government. A single member of a governing body board has zero power. Zero. Like you as a select board member are no different than me when you're out on the roads of Vermont and when you're talking to, people in town. The only time you have power is when you vote as a member of a board and your entire board agreed to do something. So it takes 3 out of 5 people to vote on something. And I don't think undermining democracy to say you can go back and decide that Ted had a conflict several years later serves our democracy well. I think that's an invitation for really unsettled law for a long time.
Thank you. I just want to bring a little of my perspective in. When I first joined school board, I struggled with that power issue that you just spoke about. Like I'm one person, I'm being approached in the grocery store and being asked to, weigh in on something. And it was made very, very clear to me that I had no authority to make any comment that would be construed as a decision, or even which way I was leaning when I'm alone outside of the board. It's the board that speaks for the decision that's being made. So that was really helpful for me. And I really also feel like you do in this situation that being an elected public servant, especially in a small town, is you can't ever totally remove yourself and work in a vacuum. You're always going to have your opinions that are formed by your experiences within that town. So I guess this is just more of a comment than a question or anything, that I really feel like having a reasonable policy for everyone in the state who serves, no matter how big or small your board or your town is, makes sense, because once again, one size does not fit all in Vermont.
Questions for Mr. Brady? Right. Given us, as usual, a lot to consider from the so thanks. I hope you'll stick around because some other things may come up as we're discussing this with our other witnesses. So thanks for being here this morning, Ted. I appreciate being a partner in trying to wade through these recommendations. So Executive Director Sibright, do you mind coming in, helping, and perhaps with the help of TJ, maybe help us understand, or both, from the Ethics Commission's perspective, how we sort of navigate some of these decisions that we're weighing around, model policy versus statewide policy or statewide municipal code.
Sure, not a problem. So I'll just address the point about voidable decisions and statute of limitations, because I was just looking into this last night in terms of the state code of ethics and complaints that might come before us. And so there is a general statute in Vermont that says there's a 6-year statute of limitations for civil action. So we're thinking about including that for when it comes to state complaints. So that would be a further suggestion when it comes to looking at complaints that might not be, so right anymore. So in terms of the state code of ethics, when we're looking at it, so, we're new to having a state code of ethics. It's very recent, and what we have is a very basic state code of ethics. So we're not one of the states that has a very convoluted state code of ethics. We're not going out in any, extreme branches when it comes to what's happening in state government. It's really just very core principles. It's a strong code of ethics because it covers everything that needs to be covered. However, it is very basic. So when we're looking at the principles that are covered by the code of ethics, they are actually applicable to pretty much anyone who works in government, and they're things that our people should already be doing. Right. So we're not, imposing any new requirements on someone. It's basic behavior that should already be happening. So what we're looking at when we're talking about a uniform state of ethics for everyone serving in government in Vermont, it's really about clearly delineating those and helping people understand what the responsibilities are, and also helping the public understand what those responsibilities are. Because as Ted mentioned, and as we noted ourselves, there were a lot of concerns that were raised during the listening sessions that wouldn't necessarily be covered, by this particular code of ethics, like open meeting law issues, public records issues. But that's like a service that the Ethics Commission, or a service that is helped along by the code of ethics, where people really understand what the responsibilities are. They may have a complaint, it may not fall under the code of ethics. They may have a complaint that may be something that they disagree with, a policy decision, but it's not the type of complaint that's going to become for a body to hear that complaint. So we're looking at the state code of ethics. It's very basic. And what we're looking to do here with having a basic code of ethics is make sure that everyone's understanding of it is clear, and that we would be there to help with the interpretation. So when you're looking at, each municipality having their own conflict of interest policy, right now, I think you're missing a place where both, municipal officers and members of the public can go to get that interpretation of what a conflict of interest is. So if we have this same definition of conflict of interest, which, Ted mentioned is very similar to the model code of ethics that's already out there, then now the gap in service that we would be filling if the state code of ethics had, the ability to provide services, because that's what we'd be doing at this stage. We're providing services to municipalities. So if somebody isn't clear, like, do I have a conflict of interest? Does, what action should the board take? Should we consider this to be a real conflict of interest? They can come to us and ask for confidential advice or guidance, or they can ask us for an advisory opinion. And we're building up that library of advisory opinions already. And so people can go and read through the opinions that are posted on our website to get that understanding without even coming to us directly if they don't want to. So when we're talking about a cookie cutter approach, I don't think it's a cookie cutter approach. It's a uniform approach. And it's a uniform approach that allows the Ethics Commission to provide services and actually help municipalities with these issues. And also help, members of the public who come to us to understand what is a real valid ethics concern and what can be handled, within the ethics framework and what isn't. So we already get those kind of calls to us. For example, just in the past few weeks, I've had people call us with policy concerns saying that they feel like something, there's an action being taken by an elected official that they don't agree with, and they think it might be unconstitutional or it might be, contrary to existing laws, but it is a policy issue, right? And so we explain to them, you have a policy disagreement, so this isn't the right forum for that. But then we also had a call recently where they said a select board member helped a business get a grant and then was hired by that business shortly thereafter at a higher rate of pay than anyone else while the people were being laid off. And so when I spoke to them about how they could handle it, they weren't aware that their town had a conflict of interest policy. I was able to find it, and they didn't know how to file a complaint. So the Ethics Commission would serve as that central resource for people to call and say, what is this? I think it's wrong. So we're able to kind of help, when we're filing a complaint, you'd be looking at this through the lens of a conflict of interest. And, as it exists now, your town does have a conflict of interest policy, but it'd be much easier to say, the state has, laws around conflict of interest when it comes to, municipal officials. This is what it is. And so we would have the ability to accept complaints and help them with a complaint. But right now, as it stands, we'd be referring it back to that municipality, which is not going to satisfy people who have those kind of complaints because they're looking for somebody to be impartial. Because when I said to this person, you should call your town clerk or somebody in your town and find out how you can file a complaint, she was just like, no, it's not worth it because nothing will happen. They're all on the same team. And so, but right now, that's how the process would work. So we're there really to aid people. And so we're looking at the system now. We're I think we've been having this discussion through the lens of what it's like for a municipal officer and serving. But we need to also look at it from the perspective of the public, because that's who really came to our listening sessions, and that's who filled out our survey. So we did have 89 responses to our survey. We had between 50 and 65 comments depending on the question, and there wasn't anyone who said everything's great. I think there were 2 people who said everything's great, but other than that, most people were like, yes, we do think that the system as it exists is imperfect. And so that's what we're looking to do. It's not, really make the status quo be enshrined in law forever. We're trying to improve the status quo and put that into law and then eventually improve those laws. If we see something that's gone too far, or we see something that's falling short, we're always going to have the ability to do that, especially if we have a separate municipal ethics code in place. And that's also where training comes in, as talking about, you know, services that we provide. The training that we provide right now to state government employees is pretty short. It's 45 minutes. And so we're envisioning something like that being available to every municipal official who is covered by the code to be able to take that short, you know, training so they understand, you know, what they should be doing, what could subject them to a complaint, what wouldn't subject them to a complaint, and then letting them know they can come to us for additional information. And so we're talking about, you know, there were a lot of, I'd say, complaints about violations of open meeting law during the listening sessions. And so that's also something you consider, you know, including in the training. If the Secretary of State's office would want to weigh in, because I think that is a really good idea. When you see that many members of the public feel like open meeting law is being violated, that's a gap. People don't need to understand open meeting laws better. So was in Northfield recently, they had to pay $100,000 for somebody who had the burden of, you know, it was an attorney, I think. And so he had to take the burden on of trying to enforce the law himself. He found somebody who's working with him, you know, for free, and the town got $100,000. So when you're looking at, you know, the Code of Ethics and the Ethics Commission and the ability for people to come to the commission for advice and guidance and potentially file complaints, it really is, you know, mitigating the risk of litigation for towns and ultimately hopefully saving people money, in addition to helping people do the right thing. So I just want to make sure I got all of the points that Raleigh, the cities in town raised as main points. We're talking about outside employment. So that is, you know, it's a very common issue. It's one of the issues that people come to us for advice most frequently. If you look at our website, you'll see some advisory opinions that address outside employment. It's not quite as strict as people might think. And so what you're really looking at here is when outside employment or an outside activity is incompatible with government employment, it's because the time commitment that outside activity takes up interferes with the ability for that person to actually do their job, or conflicts of interest arise at such a rate that person would have to recuse themselves so much that they can't do their job. So I think it is much more narrow than people think when you're actually looking at it and you have a fact pattern in front of you. So there's ways to navigate that. There are going to be some situations where, yes, this is incompatible, but there is management discretion and there is ways to work around it. And we provide advice on how to do that in terms of, like, you know, what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable, how can you buffer yourself from accusations of conflict of interest given this outside activity.
So, yeah, so I think we haven't really delved into any of the post-government employment provisions in here with you. And I think when it comes to municipalities, I want to take the concern that Mr. Brady raised pretty seriously, in that we have really small communities. Sometimes they're going to be, you know, what in a larger body would be considered kind of unthinkable. Like, you've got a person who's, you know, grading the roads is also the select board chair, right? And so they're getting paid to do a service by the select board, but they're, you know, so there's kind of a conflict that's inherent there that I think is kind of a typical thing that happens in small Vermont towns. Do these provisions, when you talk about being narrow, would these provisions that are in the bill language actually prohibit that kind of thing from happening? Because I think people are reading into it their fears, not necessarily how it's operational, and I don't really know.
It would prohibit in the most severe cases, but it doesn't prohibit when there's just the perception of that, right? So you're going to look at every fact pattern and see, like, does this outside employment activity or outside activity is it actually incompatible with government service, right? And so, like I said, like, the example I sometimes give is, you know, so say somebody works in law enforcement, but they're also like a volunteer firefighter. And so there's a lot of managerial discretion, right? Like, so somebody could say, like, no, I think we can handle, you know, this if you need to take off, you know, once a month or once every 6 months because you're called off duty for, you know, to handle your volunteer firefighting services. And that's like going to be a manager's decision. However, if that person is like out once a week, you know, during time that they're scheduled to work in law enforcement, then that's getting to a situation where it's more black and white, right? So you kind of have a range depending on the fact pattern, but it doesn't say that, you know, somebody perceives this as being incompatible. No, you actually look at the fact pattern, you see what's going on. Is this time commitment, you're taking somebody away like so frequently that they actually can't perform their job and their manager is not okay with it, right? Or is this genuinely creating a real conflict of interest where they actually can't perform their job? They can't vote on 50% of the matters that come before them. And that's a real problem, right? So this is codifying it in law, but, you know, regardless of whether it's codified in law,
they already should be recusing themselves, right? So it's kind of like a different way to look at it and to like understand the framework and the responsibilities. Did have, you know, a question recently where somebody said, okay, we have a voting member of a board who so often recuses themselves from voting that they're pretty much not doing their job. And so how should we look at this? And I'm like, okay, you can look at it two ways. You can look at it from conflicts of interest, but you can say if this person is recusing themselves from 80% of the decisions and they were appointed, you know, to this board to perform this duty, then yeah, you're going to have to start looking at that from an outside employment, incompatible outside employment framework as well. So it's kind of like two ways that you're looking at it when it comes to conflicts of interest. But at the same time, we've rarely seen situations where someone's outside activities actually conflict to such an extent that they can't maintain their position. You're just looking at situations where, like, how could they modify their outside duties? Like, is this really a problem? And when it is really a problem, then it is a problem you need to address.
So what we would be considering here, if we adopted something like what's in the draft bill on the municipal code, would give the Ethics Commission a uniform policy for all municipalities around this, and you would have the ability then to give advice. So if a town comes to you and says, hey, we want to hire someone who's on the select board's company to do some service for, you know, is there going to be a violation? And I'm imagining that in a case like that, you might say, well, that person should recuse themselves from the vote on that specific item, but otherwise you can go ahead and do that.
Yeah, they have to recuse themselves on votes that involve their business. And also when you're looking at hiring, you need to make sure that it's like an open process and that they don't have an advantage. And if there's an appearance of conflict of interest, they need to recognize that and they need to take the biggest steps to ameliorate that. So that would be, you know, that person would probably file a disclosure of conflict of interest form, which would explain like all the steps they've taken. We understand there's an appearance of conflict of interest here. These are the steps that we've taken, myself as, you know, a board member and, you know, working with the town to say like the bidding process was open, mine was the best bid. We've taken all these steps. I plan to recuse myself when matters relating to my business come before the board.
Representative Waters.
Thank you. What is the current, what's the current process of giving advice to municipalities or any ethical complaints or requests, or, you know what I mean, when people need help for that? And what is the current structure for them to file complaints or get assistance?
Because Ethics Commission, so it isn't within our jurisdiction now. So we do get calls from people, like I mentioned, the call
Yeah.
last week. And so in those situations, like just in terms of trying to be helpful to people, you know, like I'm willing to like see, does the town have a conflict of interest? I'll look it up, suggest, you know, ways that they may be able to file the complaint. But right now it's basically people call us, as Ted mentioned, they get calls, Secretary of State's office gets calls, and then people have been contacted the legislator, and it kind of just goes around in a circle. And if somebody wants to file a complaint, it really is totally dependent upon what that municipality has in place in terms of process and procedure.
How many complaints, since we've established the Ethics Commission, I mean, roughly how many municipal complaints for advice or requests for advice or complaints have come before the Ethics Commission? I mean, are we talking about a handful or are we talking about dozens?
I'd say dozens, including complaint inquiries. So I wasn't, you know, I've only been here for the last couple of years. And so I'd say maybe like a third of our calls relate to municipal issues at this point. And I think that is less than it used to be. I think that's because people recognize now that the Ethics Commission doesn't handle that. But I know at the beginning of the Ethics Commission, it was the majority of them.
Other questions for Executive Director Siebert from the committee? So it seems to me that one of the biggest decisions that we're going to need to grapple with is the question of having model policies versus a uniform policy that's just that we work out in here that's adopted for everybody, and that we say this is the municipal code, period, in Vermont. And so are there disadvantages if we, since take the lead's recommendation and say, hey, we're going to dig in and see if does the model policy that they have, is it really working well? And are there things we need to do to make sure more towns adopt it and operationalize it in some way and perhaps provide resources to the State Ethics Commission that to help? Or do we just adopt one? What are the advantages and disadvantages of those approaches?
Well, I think, from the perspective of Vermont League of Cities and Towns, they feel like, local control is the issue, and that's why we'd want to have a model policy. For us, having model policies, and I think we're talking about the model policy, we're really only talking about conflict of interest. I'm not aware of a lot of other model policies that are in existence when it comes to other issues that are covered by this proposed code of ethics. But from our perspective, having the uniform code, it's really providing a service to municipalities in the sense that not everyone is going to have to develop their own model policies, figure out how to implement them, then figure out how to interpret them, and then not have each municipality coming up with their own interpretations that might conflict for the next 10 over, because that's really what it comes down to, right? I think we're looking at core principles here. And so when we get to interpretation, I think that's the issue. And it will be from town to town, but also from, citizens within the town, within the select board, within government. So just looking at how do we interpret that versus having, one place that people can go for advice and kind of relieve that burden. Because again, it goes back to we're really looking at core principles here. We're not going out on a limb, we're not looking at anything that's new. We're not looking at anything that's like very fancy. We're just looking at things that people should already be doing. So where do people go for advice that is equally open to everyone, right? So if you're a select board, a member of select board who disagrees with your select board, if you're like a citizen who's thinking like, I would like to file a complaint, like, where do those people go? So right now, I'm not aware of a place that people can go and actually get satisfaction with like real answers to their questions. And so when we're talking about having that uniform model code, that's what makes this possible. Because to be honest, like if every single town is going to have a different model of policy when it comes to ethics or a different policy when it comes to like a code of ethics, the ethics commission isn't going to be able to do that, right? We don't have the staff. You're going to have to staff us up. We're going to give us a couple of dozen people, right? Because just in terms of like having to like examine each policy in each town and how it's been interpreted before and, going forward, that just kind of creates a mess. So what we're looking to do here is to create uniformity and, fix a system that is in some ways broken. I know that Vermont League of Cities and Towns doesn't agree with that assessment, but given the number of people that are calling around looking for assistance with municipal ethics, I think we can say that some things are broken.
Representative Hango, go ahead.
Thank you. So I'm going to go back to my school board example. It works pretty well, I think, when people have questions and concerns, because there is one model policy and they can first appeal to their select board, or in my case, a school board. And if they don't get satisfaction, they can reach out to the organization that created the model policy, which is the VSBA. And in this case, it would be the VLCT, who employ attorneys specifically for those reasons. That, to me, that's the whole reason why you would have an overarching organization that all the municipalities belong to. And I believe all municipalities do belong to the league. So if they do, that's their reference point. And I'm not really seeing why we need to duplicate that effort through a state agency when there is already an organization that exists that could be that unifying. This is what the uniform code is, and this is how it's enforced. I really don't think individual select boards are going to be the ones making those kinds of decisions and calls on whether something is truly unethical or not. I think they're going to get referred to the league unless I'm totally off base on this.
So I don't know that that's really a question for Executive
not a
Director
question.
Silver. So
It's a
so
statement.
so since we're kind of, I want to continue with the testimony, but I guess I think Representative Hango, you're bringing up a really good point, because you're acknowledging the virtue of having a model policy that's uniform and consistent, that's not up to each individual legislative body.
Yes.
And I think what I'm hearing Executive Director Sivert say is we have a model conflict of interest policy, but we don't have model policies around all of these other things like lobbying, anti-whistleblower provisions, et cetera. And so this model policy has a bunch of, sort of fundamental things. So it's more, but it's all pretty basic. And it's saying this is, our recommendation for you, legislature, to have for everybody so that we can serve everybody. Vermont League of Cities and Towns does great work. But they're essentially the advocacy representative for municipal bodies. their role might, a function that they have had is to develop model policy and to help communities adopt them. Like when we passed the law that said you have to have a conflict of interest policy, but their role isn't really to hold anybody accountable. That's not, so they have a little bit of a disadvantage in terms of us empowering the State Ethics Commission, which is totally, they don't have any bias. They don't have any dog in the fight, as it were. Whereas, us just relying on the league to help municipalities
So
is a little bit of a different thing, and maybe the right move. I mean, that we've done that kind of thing before. I just want us to really think about what the State Ethics Commission is recommending versus what we're hearing from the VLCT, and kind of balance the interests that we're hearing from.
So point well taken. I don't have an answer for that big picture, but I do have an answer for other types of unethical behavior, and that's that the league adopts more model policies that municipalities can follow. That is what the Vermont School Boards Association does. They have many model policies that each school board decides to adopt or not adopt, and most of them do get adopted because it's to our benefit to have all the school districts operating similarly when it comes to the letter of the law. So it's certainly not an answer to the bigger picture, but if there's only one model policy, then maybe there needs to be a few more about various other behaviors.
Yeah, and I just emphasize the point that, Vermont League of Cities and Towns, like, I'm sure they do amazing work, but they are a private nonprofit organization. They're not a governmental organization. So the role that they're playing in terms of providing services to municipalities is fundamentally different than what the State Ethics Commission would be doing as a government body. And just in terms of like, when we're talking about interpretation of the laws, the Ethics Commission, has the power to, I don't know how to say, we like hold the code of ethics in the sense we provide advice. And so wouldn't you rather get your advice from the State Ethics Commission that helped develop the code of ethics, that is, the designated advice giver when it comes to ethics, the government ethics, rather than, a private advocacy organization that isn't quite in the same position that we are in terms of, how that is going to hold up legally. I think they're advising you how to comply with the law versus having, kind of like the source that helped create the law, the source that's been designated with that power, like when you're getting advice, and also, sorry, losing my train of thought, but when it comes to members of the public, so Vermont League of Cities and Towns doesn't serve members of the public.
So that point is definitely well taken. And I guess I'm going to go way back to local control, and that select board members are elected by the members of their public. And in essence, by following the laws that are set out that we set, they're sort of self-governing. I mean, maybe I'm getting into the weeds of this, but we have given towns authority to govern themselves in certain respects. So I'm feeling like we need to let them do what they do best, and that is govern their towns. I'm not going to go too much farther down this rabbit hole, but I just don't know. Yeah, I don't know what the answer to this is.
Representative Hickley.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A question I'd be interested in is, you talked about a number of municipal ethics calls. Is there a printout of the general information? I don't need to know towns' names or anything like that, but is there something you could put together that would give me an indication as to what those calls were referencing?
Sure. I mean, I can tell you now. So in terms of like a printout, so it is confidential information, and we don't actually always take like the name of the town. We just let somebody, call us and ask us a question. So they generally relate to conflicts of interest, misuse of position, and occasionally outside employment activities. And so I'll say last year we got 23 complaint inquiries, and we had 15 formal complaints filed with us. So those aren't all municipal ethics. Those are mostly, regarding state government. But say, 25 to 30% of those can relate to municipalities. And if we look at the Secretary of State's office, they also log the calls they get related to municipal ethics. And so I think last year it was 74 complaints they received. And then, of course, the legislators themselves get calls from municipalities. And so I don't know how those may or may not be tracked. And then I think Ted mentioned they get 47 complaints last year. So complaint inquiries.
I know you said 74, are they inquiries or complaints?
So I don't want to speak for the Secretary of State's office. I just know that, when the Ethics Commission was stood up, municipal ethics was considered to be something that really needed to be addressed. I think then Secretary of State Jim Condos really came out strongly in favor of covering municipal ethics under, the Ethics Commission's jurisdiction. So they instituted a data collection requirement at that time for the Secretary of State's office. So they've continued doing that. I think it ended in 2020, but they continued to collect that information. And every year we get it from them for a report. And so it's ranged between, 60 something to 90 something per year since they started collecting information. And what I've been told, and I don't want to speak for them, is that they're complaints that they categorize as ethics complaints. And so some of them may be ones that fall under like what would be a state, municipal code of ethics. Some of them may not. And then I've been told in the past that they also get other complaints that may fall under the ethics, rubric, but aren't primarily about ethics. And so there's also that category of complaints as well. But I don't want to speak for them. This is just what I've heard from them over the past couple of years.
Again, I think it would help me because, as you said, some of my towns, there's the select board member and he's the road commissioner. There's a select board member and his wife is the town clerk, and the list goes on. And if I see, concerns about some of those sorts of conflicts of interest, so to speak, I can see where, a lot of my towns wouldn't be able to function if there was such strict guidelines around that sort of stuff. So, concerning for me as far as how far we go down.
Yeah, so I guess I think that that's a really good thing for us to kind of unpack and illuminate here. I don't want to be afraid of of digging in. So I like this example that you brought up around. So if you have, I'm assuming an elected clerk and or even an appointed clerk. Okay, so you've got a select board that appoints a clerk, and the clerk is the wife of one of the select board members. So there wouldn't be a prohibition necessarily on that those two public offices being held by spouses, but it would be about the select board. If the select board member didn't recuse themselves when they were talking about their spouse's salary or the appointment itself, right?
Yes.
So that's really what we're talking about here. And furthermore, and I just want Executive Director Siver to correct me if I'm wrong here, but we're not talking about enforcement, investigations, hearings. Like in the state bill, we're talking about evolving beyond just the advice. And in the municipal code, if we adopt that code in anything like what's here, the advisory role that the State Ethics Commission offers now for statewide office holders and us here in the General Assembly, et cetera, they would have a similar advisory role for municipalities. So Executive Director Sivert, if I was a citizen in one of Representative Higley's towns and I said, this is a conflict of interest, this woman and this man, are serving in these two public offices, and that can't possibly be okay. What would the Ethics Commission's role be in that kind of a situation when a member of the public comes to you and complains about that?
We would say that that's not, a prima facie case of a conflict of interest, that that's acceptable. You want to really be looking at a specific fact pattern. For example, if the select board member voted on, hiring that person. So that would be a case where we would be like, yes, that's at least the appearance or probably an actual conflict of interest there. But in that situation, that's where we provide services. So for example, so if there's an actual conflict of interest, it's already an actual conflict of interest, right? And so that citizen is probably already complaining about that situation. And, if that person should be recusing themselves, they should already be doing that. So we would be the resource where the citizen can come and, lay it out for us. These are my feelings about this. And then we can explain what is an actual conflict of interest, what is an actual, appearance of a conflict of interest under the law, what in this situation may or may not be the basis of a complaint. And then the person who's facing those accusations could come to us and be like, well, I'm confused. What should I do? Is this wrong? Is this right? We can help you navigate it. And if you want something that's in writing, you can request an advisory opinion that, you can ask us for advice and guidance before you ask for the advisory opinion. So basically, it's coming, but you can be like, I want to know what I should do. And then if I do these things, am I safe? And then we can give you an advisory opinion that says, will state, clearly, two people working in the same organization is not, in the same municipal government is not, a conflict of interest. However, it would be a conflict of interest in these types of situations. It would not be a conflict of interest in these other types of situations. And this is what you should do to protect yourself, to know when to recuse yourself, how you should handle that process.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I mean, the way I see it in that kind of hypothetical that you brought up, Representative Higley, is it's almost like the State Ethics Commission can help the community figure out how to navigate that and avoid liability and avoid public outcry and sort of say, this is how we're, if as long as you're not voting on the salary and as long as you're then there isn't a conflict of interest just for the mere fact that you happen to have spouses hold those two public offices. Representative Waters Evans.
Thank you. I wanted to say that I think touching on what both of the guests have said and what you were talking about, which is that I think inherently the issue that we're trying to address here is that the more trust people have in their local government, I don't agree respectfully with the idea that this is limiting democracy, but that rather when people feel like they can trust their local government and that there's recourse beyond the same people in their own little circle making their own decision, I think it actually improves people's general perception of the fact that they can trust their local government and the state government. I think that's what the goal is here, is to give people a path toward developing that trust, right? Like, in a sense, if there are clear rules or at least someone to go to.
Yeah, and I think that's what we heard during the listening sessions as well.
Right.
Sorry.
No, I don't want you to be sorry, but like, anything you have to say on that? Am I?
Yeah, I think what we heard during listening sessions, and this is what led to actually the language related to whistleblower protections, is that people are becoming afraid or feel like it's not useful to engage with the local government because there isn't accountability and they feel like people aren't following the rules that are already in place, and they're confused about what the rules already are on both sides. And so it has become a situation where people are deterred from actually engaging in local government, engaging in democracy, because they feel like the system is broken. And so I think if there was some kind of impartial oversight, even if it's just in terms of like there being a code that applies to everyone, that's going to increase people's confidence.
Representative Byer.
So as we're having this discussion here, I've been trying to zoom out and take a look at some situations that I've seen play out at the municipal level where this resource would have been beneficial. There was an instance in one of the municipalities that I represent, the one I reside in, early on in COVID, where there was nothing short of a catastrophic meltdown within our city council structure. And a lot of that was based in personality conflicts and accusations within the members and some members of the community. And I'm thinking that a body like this could have been a good resource to sort of help navigate that and prevent it from hitting that kind of deterioration that occurred, which pretty much resulted in a massive resignation that left us without a quorum for a number of months. So I'm just trying to find situational examples, real lived experiences, and that's just something that I wanted to point out could have helped that scenario, which was not a good look.
And it led to a number of resignations, the sort of,
Yes.
yeah.
Yes.
The finger pointing.
And to the point where there was no quorum until a special election could be held.
Representative.
Thank you. So in that case, building on that, who would have been the one to report to the State Ethics Commission that this situation is happening? Or is it up to the State Ethics Commission to be monitoring all these meetings across the state to find out what's going on? How would that have transpired that they could have helped in that situation?
Hypothetically, in my mind, I think it could have been a member of the public or a member of the board. I don't necessarily see the state itself being, the entity that is overseeing this and then engaging without request. I
So
would
I
see
just,
a member of the public or an elected member of the board itself.
so I wonder how they would know that this is the place to go to immediately as soon as something like that starts transpiring.
I mean, I think that's a conversation that we have as we continue this discussion. Yeah.
And I'll say that's where the training requirement would come in. So if everyone took that 45-minute training, they'll understand that we're the resource.
I wanted to, since you have your consultant and resource, TJ's online with us, I wanted to see, after listening to the discussion, if he wanted to weigh in on some of the questions that we've been asking and things we've been considering here. So thanks for joining us and listening in.
Thank you, and thank you for having me. I did have a few thoughts. And the first is this: the states that have initiated municipal programs across the states and have done it successfully are those that recognize that the first and most important issue is to come to a common understanding of what terms, and along those lines, having a common understanding, not just among government officials, but among the populace of what it means to have a conflict of interest. And with the current model for VLCT, which by the by, if adopted by all the municipalities, would be a very good definition of conflict of interest. But the policy that's currently in the statute right now has three fundamental problems to it. The first is that towns get to pick who they want to subject to the conflict of interest policy. The second is they get to decide what a conflict is. And again, VLCT has provided a good model as to what that might be, but not all the towns follow it. And in fact, there are and continue to be towns in the state of Vermont that don't have any conflict of interest policy, despite its mandate under law. The third problem is there's no common understanding and no mandate that anything is done about a conflict under the statute. Towns can create their own enforcement mechanism, but again, it's up to the town to decide what enforcement actions, if any, get taken. And so the problem overall is that you have towns that have different ideas of what a conflict is, and those may work well in their towns, but across the state, there's no common understanding of what a conflict of interest is. And the way that that plays out, from an economic perspective, it's inefficiencies that people who don't understand the conflict want to find out what it means to have a conflict of interest. And so they look for sources that can tell them what a conflict is. And if those citizens don't trust their local government, they're not going to trust the local government to tell them what a conflict is. And those people, more often than not, will go to other places. In most states, the Ethics Commission is the last stop that people take. When they've been frustrated with everything else, they go to the commission. And if a commission is able to have a common understanding statewide as to what a conflict of interest is, what gets done about that, and who's subject to it, those people get satisfaction when they call the commission. And they can, typically what happens is, having received that understanding, they're satisfied and they understand that there's no conflict of interest at all. So again, just the 10,000-foot view is the very successful states with municipal ethics are those that have created a common understanding, both with government officials and the populace, as to what terms mean. And those states are typically recognize that there are certain situations where you have to have different terms, or at least exceptions to some of the terms, to accommodate some of the different issues that arise at the municipal level. By way of example, I heard the example come up as to whether a selectman might have a conflict of interest if the spouse was a teacher in the public school system and the select board was voting on matters that affected education. most states would accept that EXCEPT, take that out of what would be a conflict of interest. And they would do that especially at the municipal level across the state, because the issue just really doesn't arise at the state level. But their view over it is you have a universal, uniform, consistent code. And to the extent that exceptions are necessary, and they are for municipal governments, they can accommodate those exceptions. And then it's posted and everybody in the state has a common understanding of what the rules are.
Let's back up what TJ said about, in terms of, when I get calls from members of the public, I'll say we quite frequently get people who are very upset about something, but the fact that there's somebody there to listen to them and talk them through the issue, that's a service in itself. I would say that the number of people who have called me very upset and then leave very upset, it's almost nothing, right? They come to us with a problem, they're very upset about it, you talk it through them, and they leave, if not satisfied, you've kind of taken the emotion out of it and explained it to them logically. And, in some cases, I can tell the Ethics Commission has been the first place that would actually listen to them and talk to them through the problem and through the issue. And so just having a place where members of the public can go and talk through things, I think that's a separate service, even from just, being the place that provides, official advice and guidance to municipal officials or any official.
Yeah, that brings up a question I had when we were talking about the number of inquiries or inquiry/complaints that each of the bodies, that has responded to the public reaching out and going, there's something going on in my municipality. I mean, off the top of your head, what percentage of those do you have to end up saying, I know this is something you're concerned about, but this isn't really a conflict of interest, it's X?
I would say 20%. I'm guessing off the top of my head. I would say most of the complaint inquiries and complaints that we receive are, valid on their face, in the sense that, I wouldn't call them frivolous complaints. I wouldn't say they're out of bounds. They may not be, when somebody actually investigates the facts, they may not hold up. But I'd say 80% of our complaints are, solid under the Code of Ethics complaints, and approximately 20% are ones that we talk people through and kind of explain the Ethics Commission isn't the right place for this, if this isn't really an ethics complaint, or, another organization might be better served to answer these questions for you or receive a complaint.
Yeah, because one of the concerns that I think Ted explicitly brought up from the league's perspective was that in some of the comments that came before the commission during the listening sessions about municipal ethics had to do with, really disagreements about policy, and obviously it wouldn't be appropriate for somebody to go before the ethics commission and have the ethics commission dig into, should the select board have, made one decision or another, right? So I believe we have another witness, so that is able to join us for a short time with comments on the municipal piece. So does anybody have anything else at this point for TJ or Executive Director Sibrett? Okay, thank you both so much. We have a lot to discuss on this municipal code issue. I want to welcome Louis Mudge. Could you introduce yourself and
Sorry, I cut you off. Go ahead. Sorry.
No problem. I just was inviting you to introduce yourself and tell us your thoughts on our municipal code of ethics discussion. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. And just as a preamble, I'm afraid I was on another call, I was on a work call, so I've jumped on late and I've missed some of what was said before. So I apologize in advance for that. My name is Louis Mudge. I'm in a second term on the select board here in Charlotte. And I was elected in my first term. I was elected in 2020. And at the time, there were, without going into too much detail, there were a lot of allegations around perceived conflict of interest and potentially real conflict of interest with regards to a select board decision on the zoning, on a broad sort of zoning policy here in Charlotte. And when I was elected, I had, that was before my time coming in, before March. When I was elected, I was sort of tasked, because some of my background, I was tasked with having a look at our town's conflict of interest policy and seeing if we didn't want to make changes and get it up to snuff. And I've read through the documents that were sent to me with regards to this call today, and I'm afraid I'm not going to be sort of saying one way or another what I think should happen. But I guess it might be illustrative to sort of walk through the problems that I had. I then took a few months to take it upon myself to try to reach out. I reached out to VLCT. I got some great input from them. I reached out to a number of different municipalities, primarily here in Chittenden County, and spoke with select board members after finding their conflict of interest policies online and finding interesting language in those policies that could maybe be applicable to Charlotte. And I then came up with a draft policy that I proposed that we discuss in the select board. Long story short, we've taken no action. That was a number of years ago. So we're still on very much a boilerplate, one paragraph policy. And I'm happy to sort of walk through what I think some of the challenges were with not being able to get what I think was a more robust policy online. But I think it can be distilled down to one point, which is that I failed to convince other select board members that what was, in my opinion, is true, is that a strong conflict of interest policy can actually be advantageous for the select board and can protect the select board and can enable us to get on with work without, rumors being spread around us. Charlotte's a very, very small town. For those of you who might not know it, we all kind of know each other. Everyone's got like a neighbor involved in some type of development issue or a brother. And I thought that having a more robust policy and more transparent policy would free us to take more decisions. But I don't think that was necessarily the consensus. In the end, we've decided to keep sort of really just a very broad one paragraph. I think it's the same language that's on the VLCT website now, or at least it was a few years ago. And we very rarely discuss any potential conflicts of interest openly. Instead, unfortunately, and I'm speaking obviously this is anecdotal, excuse me, but I'm speaking in, real time. Unfortunately, we get it's the sort of back channel text messaging amongst people that comes in with regards to a potential or a perceived conflict of interest. So I'm not, I'm not sure a sort of the state moving towards a standard, I have no, thoughts on for the moment on sort of what that would look like, that standard. But what I can say is that I think the standard now of simply having one and making sure it exists without maybe there's space to beef up the language with regards to what the municipality should be doing. I find that it's terribly frustrating to have put work into something and really the response is like, no, we think it's fine as is. And being told basically these types of issues do kind of die down and people move on. So we don't need to really bring up this issue of conflict of interest, potential conflict of interest, or perceived conflict of interest in municipal meetings. We can kind of just move on, and eventually there'll be another issue and we'll kind of muddle our way through it. I'll stop there and pause for questions.
So do I understand correctly, Mr. Mudge, that the town of Charlotte adopted a policy, but I guess what I want to let you know is that one of the big things we're struggling with, that as a local select board member, and I'm sure we'll talk to other municipal officials, is whether it would be helpful to have a uniform policy across the state, or whether it's really important for each individual municipality to adopt its own conflict of interest and other policies that have to do with ethics, like anti-whistleblower ordinances, or a code that would prohibit adopting anti-whistleblower policies.
Yeah, I can tell you from my perspective as being one of 5 on the board in Charlotte, I think it would be advantageous for us. Again, one of 5. I think it would be advantageous for us to have the state give us more guidance on what a conflict of interest, what a COI policy could look like, because we do have a policy, but it's very, very, in my opinion, it's aspirational and it's vague, and I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. And there's a failure to understand that a more robust policy, in my opinion, there's a failure to understand that a more robust policy is actually better for the select board. And so while I'm not for Montpelier telling all the municipalities what to do, and Shay can attest to that. I certainly think there is space to get more guidance from Montpelier on what a more robust policy could look like.
Other questions for Mr. Mutch? Representative Waters Evans.
Thank you. Hi, Liz. So when people have concerns in Charlotte about conflict of interest, or they have a complaint, or if they're wondering if there is a conflict, to whom do they go? Do they go to you? Do they go to the select board chair? Do they go to the town manager? The town administrator? What is their process? Or do you hear these things? Like, how does it work?
Yeah, I mean, I tried to allude to that earlier. Unfortunately, it's not a very formal process, and so it's usually done in probably not a very productive way, which is individuals reaching out to other individuals with whom they have a personal relationship and relating that information. But I would say that we don't have the environment that fosters sort of people transparently challenging, whether it be DRB or select board members, in a transparent and open way with regards to potential conflicts of interest. And we don't have a climate in which those potential conflicts of interest are addressed preemptively. So that leads itself to a climate in which things are done more behind the scenes. And I don't think that's necessarily a good thing. I don't think that's healthy. I mean, just to sort of, with regards to the anecdote in which I was elected, in which there was a lot of accusations, there is the flip side of the coin is a lot of people are hurt by these accusations. And, sometimes these accusations of a conflict of interest are not founded. Just because, someone is the brother of someone else doesn't mean, in theory, that there has to be a conflict of interest. And so, you do get the flip side, which is, people in a small town like Charlotte take these accusations very, very seriously, and they're very hurtful. And that they, you hear the argument that this puts me off of volunteerism. Select board members in Charlotte, we put in many hours a week, as you all know. These are unpaid gigs, and there's a real sense. The argument on the flip side is, well, look, if this is the way it's going to go, in which everything I do is going to be looked over, and there's going to always be questions of a conflict of interest, I shrug my shoulders and I'll just give up.
So I just want to be clear, is it your opinion that having a uniform code statewide would actually reduce the amount of inquiry or confusion and conversations about conflict of interest? So if we set a standard and everybody kind of understands what that is, that it would help alleviate that concern?
I'm not sure to what extent it would help alleviate the concern. I think having a standard statewide would at least enable the municipalities to, in some ways, blame it on Montpelier and say, well, look, like, Montpelier's making, this is what we have now. And, I tried really hard, some other municipalities do this. I tried really hard just to have an opening sentence to all of our select board meetings and DRB meetings, in which the chair would say, you've all seen the agenda. Are there any potential conflicts of interest on the horizon in this meeting? 10 seconds. And there was pushback on that in of itself. And so I do think we're at a point where getting a bit of directives from Montpelier is a good thing. To what extent it's going to alleviate this issue, that's an open question. Look, these are small towns. We all know each other. We've already said that before. There's personal beefs. There's always going to be those types of beefs. And we're talking, in many instances, we're talking about development. So, when it comes to curb cuts and development and those types of issues and who has houses where, that gets very personal. But I do think we're at a point where some assistance from Montpelier would be, in my opinion, again, 1 of 5, but would be a good thing.
Questions for Mr. Mudge? I imagine we'll hear from other folks who are on select boards and councils and commissions as we pursue this over the next couple of weeks and try to decide what to do. But I really appreciate you coming and sharing your perspective with us.
Good stuff. Thanks very much.
You. So committee, I think we're due for a little break. What I'd like to do when we come back in about 15 minutes is talk a little bit as a committee about what we've heard on municipal code and see if there are kind of things we want to have anybody do any research or feedback on. And then I want to flip to looking at some of the statewide pieces while we have Director Sivert here and look at that. So we'll pick up the conversation with the committee. Let's call it